Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're waiting for one more panelist, but I think she'll be here soon. So our panel today is on information wars and human rights. We have 4 great individuals who are going to give lectures today. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Lilia Arakelyan. She is a professor in the International Relations Department at Florida International University. Dr. Arakelyan has worked on numerous academic and policy-oriented projects on Russia and the independent states of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the South Caucasus. Her research interests include Russian foreign policy in the post-Soviet space, different aspects of nationalism, ethno-national conflicts in the South Caucasus, and international security more broadly. Dr. Arakelyan was an inspirational fellow at the Caucasus Resource Research Center, where she conducted independent research on the upsurge of violence and the mediation in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Dr. Arakelyan currently teaches international relations courses at Florida International University and works as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program. She is the author of Russian Foreign Policy in Eurasia, National Interests, and Regional Integration. Dr. Arakelyan, thank you for joining us. She will be joining remotely. Dr. Arakelyan, can you hear us? Oh, we can't hear her. Okay, while we figure out the technical difficulties, we do have Maria Armoudian, who is here. We're going to have her speak while we figure out the sound situation, but I'd like to introduce Dr. Maria Armoudian to you all. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, founder and producer of the Scholars Circle radio program, and the author of 3 books, Lawyers Beyond Borders, Advancing International Human Rights Through Local Laws and Courts, Kill the Messenger, the Media's Role in the Fate of the World, and Reporting from the Danger Zone, Frontline Journalists, Their Jobs, and an Increasingly Perilous Future. She has published widely on human rights, environmental politics, communication, and good governance. Before coming to the University of Auckland, she served as a commissioner in the city of Los Angeles for 6 years and worked in the California State Legislature for 8 years, working on many issues ranging from environmental sustainability to good government and corporate reform. In addition to her academic publications, her articles have been published by the Washington Post, the Columbia Journalism Review, Psychology Today, Open Democracy, the New York Times Syndicate, the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, the New Zealand Herald, the Los Angeles Daily News, The Progressive, Salon.com, Newsroom, The Conversation, Truth Out, Alternate Inc., Daily Variety, and Billboard. Maria is also a songwriter and musician. Thank you for being here.
Can they put the slide up? Or you have to hit that? Okay.
Do you want to do it from up here?
No, that's okay. That's all right. I've got this here, so.
No, she'll let us turn off. She'll put on a second.
Oh. Well, then I'll just, while they're getting that up, let me just reiterate how happy I am to be here. I was just so excited about the conference, and I'm even more excited now that I'm here. I just think it's an extraordinary bunch of people with an extraordinary cause. And I'm looking forward to working with everybody on Justice for Artsakh on this. So today what I'm going to do is talk about my previous work. So the last panel I talked about Lawyers Beyond Borders, which features Judith Chomsky, and who's here. She's featured in that because of the extraordinary work that she and the other human rights lawyers have been doing on behalf of survivors of egregious human rights violations. But my previous work is around mass media, war, genocide, human rights violations, as well as peacemaking. And so obviously, as most of us know already, and we also heard earlier about the Armenophobia and the hate media that has been used by Azerbaijan. So obviously media are part of the war, right? It's sort of the parallel war that is used to persuade people to destroy another group of people. And there are different ways in which this is done. And the framing that I have noticed the most that lead to persuading people that their fellow human beings should be destroyed are what I call hate frames and genocidal frames. And hate frames are a type of framing that blames one group of people for a socio-political problem that they alone didn't cause if they caused it all, and dehumanizes them, others them, often says that, they don't belong here. And then a genocidal frame, which worsens it even more, often has either kill or be killed framing. It's all within an us versus them, good guys versus bad guys kind of thing. But it also, the genocidal frame also invokes a grand cause, some kind of great glory. Sometimes it's for majoritarian democracy, which it was in Rwanda. Actually, they said you had to kill the Tutsi in order to establish this majoritarian democracy. Or in the Holocaust, it was for this utopia. So these are some of the frames that are used by political leaders to try to persuade their people to destroy another group of people. The last quote that I have there was a Bosnian scholar, Mirsad Abazovic. I still can't talk. See, I've been awake for like many hours and I still can't talk. But I thought that this kind of encapsulates it. A bullet can kill a man, but the ideas behind the bullet can kill thousands or more. So let's see if I can figure out which button to push. I think it's this one. So one of the studies that I did was Rwanda versus Burundi, and both of them were genocidal, but is that there? Right. Yeah. So the difference, though, however, was that after the Rwandan war and before Burundi ended up erupting into yet another genocide, I should say the Rwandan genocide, the Burundian genocide, a lot of international organizations got together and went to Burundi and set up a media that would serve to counter the kind of hate frames and the genocidal frames. And for a short period of time, it really worked, where they brought Hutu and Tutsi journalists together to actually produce the media, where they protected each other, they explored the kind of reasons for the war together, and they had to agree on the framing and everything that went into the framing before it went out to the public. And it was, like I said, it was successful for a short period of time before the government shut it all down again, in which they really helped. It was a big part of the peace process. And so I used these sort of as next to each other because they, once upon a time it was Rwanda, Burundi. It was, it's the same history and the same ethnic groups. And so when you compare them like that side by side, you can see that creating a media that is counter to these hate frames and genocidal frames, what I call, ethical journalism, kind of peaceful journalism that seeks to get to the bottom of these issues and honor the humanity of everybody, you can actually make a difference. So the next frame is about how this is so complicated today because of the internet. Because now, today, governments, authoritarian governments, as well as others, whatever people have to say about Donald Trump, he was an authoritarian, even though he was elected. But authoritarian governments and extremist groups all have their own media. And so they have disintermediated traditional journalists. They don't need them anymore. There was a time when the journalists could go between combatants and sort of get each side of the conflict and try to make sense of it in one way or the other. Not needed anymore. So now journalists are kind of part of the problem for extremists and for authoritarian governments. They don't want them. They don't need them. And so oftentimes they are at great risk. So I'm looking at the slides you're seeing on to see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that, which is at the bottom left on yours, right on mine, about the customs desk. So a lot of times, it's a simple Google search to check somebody. And if that journalist happens to be neutral in some cases, don't let him in, just don't let him into the region. So ethical journalism, on the other hand, it's kind of like what they were trying to do in Burundi. It can mean life or death, just like the hate frames and the genocidal frames can mean life or death. Ethical journalism, in many cases, can be kind of the opposite. It can bring people together and help protect human rights. And the examples are fewer than the ones where it causes conflict, but they are examples. And the journalists in Northern Ireland are an example. At the time, they actually helped to bring about the peace process. They covered that peace process. They treated people as humans, even when others didn't want to treat each other as humans. But mainly what I say about ethical journalism is that they don't just reiterate authoritarian frames. He said this, she said that. What the journalists did in Burundi at the time was that even when these leaders who wanted to fuel the conflict because they were getting something from it would say some really awful thing about the other, they'd say, sorry, you're not getting on the air with that message. Come back with something constructive. And it actually worked as an incentive. Sadly, like I said, today with the internet, it's a little more complicated because as we see in the Artsakh war, Azerbaijan had its own media. Armenia does too, but the Azerbaijani media was so full of hate, and I've got a slide to talk about that in just a second. In addition, ethical journalism doesn't look just at the problems. It does look at the problems, but it looks for solutions. So it's kind of in the questions that get asked. So, what is the cause of the problem? What are the complex facets to it? What is the cost of this problem on us? And what are the potential solutions? That's a different set of questions than what we get in a lot of these conflict journalism. And that then can help policymakers not make the deadly errors. Today, sadly, not only do we have the problem of authoritarians and extremist groups having their own media, we also have the problem that in the current model, which is a for-profit model, there's not nearly enough money to be made, and so they're shutting down bureaus and letting go of journalists, and so you don't have nearly as many journalists to cover the conflicts, so most conflicts don't get covered. And we have seen that also with the Artsakh issue, right? Hardly got coverage. Ukraine, whole front page, inside page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, everywhere else in the world. Artsakh, maybe an opinion piece. How many more minutes? 10. Okay, very good. Then when I better go a little, let's see how fast I can talk. I'll pretend I'm my mother. Oh, sorry. Do not let her, I'm being taped, darn it. So the problem is, of course, truth being the first casualty. Most people don't know what's going on in the world. One of the other people in the book that Judith is in is Beth von Skak, who is now an ambassador for human rights and war crimes for the United States. And she didn't even know about Artsakh. So, truth is the first casualty. It's hard to keep people informed. So why do we, what are the factors for what we get and what we don't get? One of them is access and danger. And so journalists, first of all, if there aren't enough journalists, you don't get covered. But secondly, if they can't get safe access, which is so common now that authoritarians have their own media, that it becomes complicated in that way. Censorship, also a very phenomenon. But then also the emotions of the journalist and the news norms. Like, what is news to the audience? Is Artsakh news to an American audience? It's hard to make that case, except for where there are a lot of Armenians. And then, of course, some journalists end up with PTSD and can't keep... Oh, look, I wasn't even skipping through here. God, what a dummy I am. Anyway, so let's skip that. Censorship and punishment is where I think we are ending up. So censorship happens in many forms, but in some cases, and Azerbaijan is one of them, they imprison journalists if they don't follow the line. But also there's self-censorship by the journalists themselves out of fear of either getting deported or removed from their beat or something. And in other cases, it could be much worse. We've seen a lot of journalists get killed, beheaded, etc. So that brings me to this section by Olivia Guyoto, who was my student. And she's my master's student now. She did her honors thesis with me, and this was one of the things that she put together, which was she compared first the press freedom and the freedom scores, which is just from Freedom House. But you can see the difference between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijan scores 10 versus Armenia, which is 55, partly free versus not free, really. And you'll notice down at the last bullet point, foreign journalists are given full access in Armenia, whereas they're severely limited in Azerbaijan. And if I keep going, I just gathered up a few of these bits and pieces with Azerbaijan ranking among the worst jailers of journalists in the world. At least 10 were, this was in 2017, was the last number I could get. But during the conflict, we saw at least 6 journalists injured, 2 in Shushi, 4 in Marduni, and then Azerbaijan blamed Armenia for facilitating journalists to get in there. Then there were Azerbaijani journalists who were also detained and injured, being prevented from broadcasting. And then 2 in Armenia were assaulted by a mob. That sadly might have been our fault. But the journalists that do go into Nagorno-Karabakh, if they don't get permission, which usually means they have to abide by some kind of censorship, they are accused of being in there illegally, and then they are at risk. So that's another big problem. Others obviously just being banned. The last thing I think I want to do is put up Olivia's score here, in which she went through the government media of Azerbaijan and the government media of Armenia and compared language. And these are just simple counts that she did, where the Azerbaijani media referring to Armenians 17 times as terrorist, whereas the Armenian media called Azerbaijani people 7 times as terrorist, using the word vile 8 times by the Azerbaijani media, whereas the Armenian media never called Azerbaijanis vile. So you can see this comparison, and if you look down the left hand, you see a lot of scores, 18, 45, 31, 24, 10, 31, 26, and they're all like, where she says animal imagery, it's like calling them things like, dehumanized animals, whether I can't remember whether it was snakes or what it was, but it was something to dehumanize the Armenian people. Cockroaches out of Rwanda as well, so that's kind of something. Vandals and criminals was a very common one, perhaps the most common one. Fascist was one that was bandied around quite a bit. But then you look on the Armenian government side, and you'll see the only one that really is used a lot is the accusation of deliberate destruction, which happened to be true. And then the accusation of cultural genocide happened to be true. But the rest of them, you see a lot of 0s and 8s. Not saying the Armenian government media was completely innocent. I'm sure there were occasions, but they were mostly not dehumanizing, not using hate media, whereas you can see the Azerbaijani media was. And so that's also Olivia's work that I just wanted to bring here, so you could see kind of a comparison there of what she's done. And I'll leave it there, and then if there are questions, we can talk about that. Thank you. And I did that within the 10 minutes, didn't I?
I think that's everyone's issue, the panelists. They all want to try and finish right before they see that red card and everything. That's been a theme going on. I think we're up and running with the technical issues. So if we can get Dr. Arakelyan back, she can start with her presentation.
Hello?
We hear you.
Yes, what happened, my video doesn't work, so I'm sorry about that. We are
Dr. Arakelyan, in that case, if you guys are going to go in order, I would like to do the introductions for Hanna, Kassab, and Florentina, Andreescu, and then you can go in order, okay?
okay.
So Hanna Kassab is a professor in the political science department at East Carolina University. He holds degrees in political science and history from McMaster University, York University, and the University of Miami. His interests include international relations theory, national security, politics of the far right, and nationalism, active political suicide, and foreign policy. Dr. Kassab's list of recent publications include Weak States in International Relations Theory, The Cases of Armenia, St. Kitts and Nevis, Lebanon, and Cambodia, and Reconceptualization, Security in the Americas in the 21st Century. And Florentina Andreescu, who is also joining us, is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, holds a doctoral degree in international studies from the University of Miami. Combining insights from the study of politics, global economy, and psychoanalysis, her research investigates issues of radical social change, embodiment, social trauma, and identity. She has published widely in scholarly journals and is the author of From Communism to Capitalism, Nation and State in Romanian Cultural Production, and the co-editor of Genre and the Post-Communist Woman, Analyzing Transformations of the Central and Eastern European Female Ideal. She is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Embodiment and Global Capitalism, which aims to generate a better understanding of the degree by which global capitalism impacts daily embodied lives. Thank you very much, and please continue with the presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting us, and I am going to discuss the theoretical part of our project that has to do with fantasy and propaganda. And I would need our PowerPoint, if that is available. If not, I can go on without it. I don't hear it. Okay.
I think we have it up.
I see it.
Yes.
Can we go to the next slide, please?
It's mine.
Okay, so where is mine, Lilia?
Florentina, we can share the screen.
Okay, I don't need a slide then. So historian Yuval Noah Harari, in his book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, highlights human language's unique ability to conceive and communicate information about things that simply do not exist. As far as we know, solely humans feel enticed to think and talk about an entire array of things which they have never actually encountered or experienced. Fiction, often disregarded in social sciences as trivial, rests at the core of society, enabling us to collectively imagine dimensions of the world that do not yet exist. For instance, we weave common myths about nations and states, and through them come together and cooperate as complex imagined communities. While fantasy can unleash creativity, it also holds a dark side. As discussed later in this presentation, it can lure people, subjects, into accepting ideological oppression as a form of liberation or even as revolutionary behavior. Currently, humanity reached a stage when a significant part of our social, economic, political, and cultural lives take place in the virtual space, an ontological register where the information about concrete aspects of the world blends with fantasy. Accessing both reality and fantasy through screens and social media unavoidably weakens our ability to discern the separation between the two. In this evolving social context, humans' capacity of joining together in collective dreams could also become its Achilles heel. That is the case because not being able to distinguish between fantasy and reality or between truth and false holds the potential to generate both disorientation and fragmentation in society. For example, this occurred when entire communities refused to accept that COVID-19 pandemic was an actual event, that Joe Biden in the United States won the presidential election, and most recently that the devastating war in Ukraine is actually taking place. Old-fashioned propaganda seems to mutate into insidious forms, especially in the hands of modern-day dictators. The difficulty distinguishing between real and fake is an element of uttermost importance, requiring careful analysis. The situation is to a large extent associated with the unprecedented expansion of social media into our lives, infiltrating even the ethos and the purpose of the state. It further impacts the public sphere, the nature of politics, as well as the relationship between citizens and the state, metamorphosing the role of the citizen into that of a spectator. As the government and the democratic political system give way to the logic and values associated with entertainment industry, active political engagement morphs into the passive stance of an observer, seeking within the political spectacle both amusement and existential validation. Politics, media, and entertainment are merging into a new, powerful, mesmerizing, and an utterly confusing world. As the attention of our contemporary society is mainly directed towards representations at the expense of the world itself, the representation becomes privileged as most valuable and most real. Namely, we are witnessing the development of a culture of image, which, with its limited ontological dimensions, takes priority over the complexity and unpredictability of our life world. The transfer of the social, political, and personal dimensions of our lives onto the imaginary ontological plane. It also gives the impression that our lives are infinitely more manageable. Seated in front of our computers, we acquire an exhilarating feel of not only space and time transcendence, but also of omniscience and omnipotence. The sense of control that one has at one's fingertips in the virtual space. It's simply not possible in the three-dimensional existence. For instance, we access news from all corners of the world, retrieve instantly information on any topic of interest, friend and unfriend people with a click of a button, shop a vast array of products, access entertainment, or search for romance. The gained sense of agency lures us into exchanging the depth and complexity of the embodied human existence for the two-dimensional plane of the visual register. However, the sense of agency gained is to a large extent illusory. Often, we confuse the passive consumption of fabricated information and our utter compliance with conspiratorial noxious logic, not only with agency, but also with revolutionary behavior. Increasing relying on media to connect and learn about the world, together with technological innovations that allow the creation and dissemination of deep fake videos, generate an unprecedented ontological confusion, as large communities accept fictional occurrences as real. Situated within this space, this social space, and this universe of fabricated information has significant social and existential consequences. It leads to an alteration of human perception, where what was exaggerated appears real, endowed to the manufactured authenticity, while what was once considered reality is perceived as devitalized, outdated, boring, and empty. One of the most significant concerns deriving from this situation is the confusion in communication in our ability to make sense of the world. While some lies do involve affirmative claims that something occurred when in fact it never did, what we often witness are lies that take form of denials. The possibility of generating, manipulating, and disseminating false news gives the option of those accused of wrongdoings to create doubt about accusations by using altered videos and audio evidence that appear to contradict the claim. This is what political scientists Robert Chesney and Daniel Citron calls the liar's dividend. The liar's dividend is enabled by current pervasive truth skepticism. Recent years have seen mounting distrust of traditional sources of news. The expression fake news is often used as a convenient substitute for an argument or for an explanation when one is confronted with damaging factual assertions. As deep fake news is increasingly a possibility to consider in everyday life, public cynicism is so pronounced that people simply have difficulty believing what their eyes and ears are telling them. Thank you. This was my part of the presentation. Lilia, I think you're next.
Yes, I am next. And can you hear me? If you don't mind, please, can I have the slides? So Florentina presented the theoretical framework for our chapter, for our article. I will be presenting now the case study. So basically, I'm going to apply the theoretical framework that Florentina presented to the second Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I'm starting with the Russian information warfare because, as you know, it's considered to be one of the best information warfare in political science. I cannot see my slides.
Dr. Arakelyan, if you can share your screen, I think we'll be able to see your PowerPoint and yes, and that way you can control the slides.
Okay, sounds good.
15 minutes, and then afterwards, I think we'll have enough time, and we'll go through some questions together.
All right, lovely. Thank you so much.
Okay, sounds good. Florentina also, we sent Florentina slides as well. Okay, so recently many analysts have focused on the emergence of the so-called Russian information warfare, including computer network operations, electronic warfare, psychological operations, deception campaigns, maskirovka, and programming impact. Ronald Herko argues that the Russian approach to information warfare differs from that of the Western countries as well as from the Chinese position. Moscow considers information as a crucial tool of its domestic and foreign policy that needs to be protected in times of peace and war. This is something important because we are arguing that the Azerbaijani approach is similar to the Russian approach. Russia's 2010 military doctrine defines information as a valuable asset during the initial phase of a conflict to weaken the command and controllability of the opponent, and in the form of information campaign during the actual battle to create a positive view within the international community. This is something important because, as we can see now, Azerbaijan, after committing war crimes during the second Nagorno-Karabakh war still hasn't been actually held accountable for it. Meanwhile, the 2020 aggression of Azerbaijan and Turkey against the unrecognized Republic of Artsakh and Armenia diverted the attention of political analysts and scholars to the Baku and Ankara's use of information warfare before, during, and after the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. Our study tends to create a proper database of Azerbaijani and Turkish propaganda, segmented by media, topic, target audience, and reach that will greatly improve the works of all analysts studying Baku and Ankara's information warfare. And I have to say this is work in progress and this is something new. Hybrid wars already dominate 21st century conflict and will continue to do so. Azerbaijan believes it must adapt to win the struggle, profoundly shaping Azerbaijani military development and assessments of the future of war. Now let's talk about the concept of hybrid warfare. The term hybrid warfare describes the concurrent use of conventional and irregular forces in the same military campaign. I would like to go back to my previous slide so you can see the different tools that it's used during the hybrid warfare. As you can see, it's traditional military forces as well as non-traditional military forces, including diplomacy, cyber attacks, economic warfare, support of local unrest. Information warfare is just one of the tools of the hybrid warfare. So the term hybrid warfare describes the concurrent use of conventional and irregular forces in the same military campaign. Frank Hoffman defined hybrid warfare as different modes of warfare, including conventional capabilities, irregular tactics, and formations, terrorist acts, including indiscriminate violence and coercion, and criminal disorder conducted by both sides, and a variety of non-state actors. The concept of hybrid warfare is not new and novel, as the same subversive techniques and tools were used in the past by states and their intelligence agencies. For instance, the Soviet KGB used disinformation and propaganda as a tool of asymmetrical warfare in the Cold War. The same did the CIA to prevent the spread of communism in the United States. However, hybrid warfare has taken a new dimension with the advent of technology and the digital world, as Florentina brilliantly presented her part. Cyberspace can be manipulated to spread propaganda and weaponized in the form of cyber hacking. Now let's talk specifically about Azerbaijani hybrid warfare. Azerbaijan, ruled by an authoritarian regime controlled by a single family, the Aliyevs, since 1993, was backed by Turkey during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. This is very important because, as you know, Turkey is the second largest army in NATO, and Of course, Turkey also uses hybrid warfare in its military campaign. The Aliyev regime is currently enjoying massive public support due to its victory in the fall 2020 war with Armenia and Artsakh. However, the conflict remains a source of instability and tensions among Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Republic of Artsakh, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Azerbaijan uses hybrid warfare to ensure compliance on a number of specific policy questions. The first one, to divide and weaken Armenia. The second one, to subvert pro-Russian sentiments in Artsakh and Armenia. The third one, to create pretexts for wars. The fourth one, to annex territory. The fifth one, to ensure a peace treaty with Armenia on its own terms. And finally, to ensure access to European markets on its own terms. The first major cyber attacks between Armenian and Azerbaijani hackers can be traced back to the early 2000s, with the involvement of two groups, the Armenian hacker group Liazor and the Azerbaijani Green Revenge, which temporarily disabled almost all websites in both countries. Azerbaijan started building a top-down common structure. The guerrilla groups left the scene, and the media channels in the country were almost completely taken control of. This resulted in a well-controlled and efficiently operating model, which was guided mostly by the Soviet structure. In Armenia, on the contrary, they chose the hybrid model, which offers the integration of state-owned structures and free groups into a single network, which covers the whole of the information realm and media space. So, once again, we would like to say that this is work in progress. Now I'm going to present a couple of themes that the Azerbaijani information propaganda followed, but still, it's just a small part of the topics that we are going to cover in our final paper. So the first one, hard to verify content. It has been argued that the fake news published during fierce battles is often created by the state propaganda machine. It is often hard to verify the content of the fake news on social media. For instance, the news is framed as a personal experience or lacking a central claim. Narratives can often achieve their goal to be plausible to the public without violating the platform rules against misinformation. We are talking about Twitter, Instagram, and other platforms that users are using. Okay, so top-down disinformation, anti-Armenian narratives. Top-down disinformation narratives are spread by online influencers who benefit from platform affordances that allows a few individuals to set the agenda for millions of users, something that Florentina also alluded in her presentation. The influencer can be a politician, a scholar, a celebrity, or a media representative, which creates a sense of legitimacy around influence content, in which social proof drives further sharing and endangers the trust of the audience receiving the message. For instance, just to give you a really quick example, during the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, Cardi B is the popular singer in the United States, and Elton John, they posted pro-Armenian narratives on Twitter. But because of the Azerbaijani users, they had to take down their posts. According to Nanuri Barsumyan report in the Armenian Weekly, Azerbaijan US-based lobbyists are at the forefront of an information warfare that costs millions of dollars annually. A smear campaign through US media outlets, from Bloomberg to CNN, the Washington Post, and so on, pictures Armenia as a close ally of Iran and Russia that undermines Western democratic values. Once again, I would like to point out that we're talking about the US audience. Armenians are intolerant, according to these narratives, anti-Semitic and anti-Ukrainian. Azerbaijan is depicted as an ally of Israel and Ukraine, a champion of religious and democratic rights. Azerbaijan, according to these narratives, Azerbaijan employs many Western political scientists who disseminate state-sponsored propaganda with anti-Armenian narratives. For example, a very well-established scholar, Svante Cornell, director of the American Foreign Policy Council Central Asia Caucasus Institute, and a co-founder of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, has personal ties with the Aliyev family and always maintained a pro-Azerbaijani position over the years. His institute received multiple grants from the companies linked directly to the Azerbaijani government. The Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs annually gives 6 to 10 million Swedish krona to his research institute, despite its links to the dictatorship of Azerbaijan. Thank you very much, dear Mr. President. First of all, let me congratulate you and the people of Azerbaijan on the restoration of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. It is clear that this historic achievement has changed the politics of the Caucasus region and far beyond. Most importantly, I think it has shown to the world the capabilities of Azerbaijan and the resolve of the Azerbaijan statehood. These words were addressed to Azerbaijan's dictator Ilham Aliyev by Svante Cornell during an online seminar in April 2021, just 6 months after Azerbaijan's aggression, the end of the Azerbaijani aggression in Nagorno-Karabakh. In a new report, the human rights body Freedom House described the invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh as an inspiration for how authoritarian regimes can strengthen their power with the help of war. Now, so the last two narratives, the second one is groups and online communities. Groups and online communities create the foundation for bottom-up dynamics, allowing like-minded individuals to engage in collective sense-making. Groups, community boards, and similar platform infrastructure democratize the opportunity of large-scale reach, as users who may not have significant political or social capital are able to rally the online communities. They feel that they are a part of and spread their message widely through this network. Facebook groups, Reddit boards, or Telegram channels, popular in Russian and Armenian, not so much in the West, that lack a clear moderator or leader, display the dynamic characteristics of these communal online spaces. Social media platforms can be used to create opportunities for protest or assembly. They often use to coordinate, harm. For instance, during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, Armenian soldiers were often beheaded and their pictures were displayed on Twitter. In addition, Azerbaijani soldiers would use the Armenian soldiers' mobile phones, contact their relatives, and then send the pictures of the deceased relatives, often tortured to death. While in Azerbaijan, all social networks were blocked during the 2020 war, social networks in Armenia were the main source of dissemination of fake news. So we would like to point out, and finally to talk about the Armenian information propaganda. So there is a big difference between propaganda, which is state sponsored, and the use of soft power, which can be, advertised by culture influence, language influence, and so on and so forth. We included also one segment of Armenian propaganda, which was done by the Artsakh Hovanesyan. So the phenomenon of Artsakh Hovanesyan during the war in 2020, Lieutenant Colonel Artsakh Hovanesyan became one of the most visible and trusted figures for Armenian society. He became a primary public representative of the Minister of Defense during both the July 2020 escalation in Nagorno-Karabakh and the 2020 war. Starting in late September 2020, Hovanesyan gave regular public briefings about the war at the Armenian Unified Information Center, which was established as a state non-commercial organization within the office of the Prime Minister to provide reliable and urgent information to the public in emergency situations, according to the center. The Armenian public grew to expect daily updates about the war from Hovanesyan, who quickly became a primary and trusted source. His reports became more important as dangerous conditions and restrictions on wartime reporting prevented regular journalists from reaching most of the front line. From the early days of the war, Hovanesyan and other officials adopted the rallying cry and hashtag Hakdeluen, we are going to win. and it became a staple in public discourse about the war, both on social media and offline. For nearly a month of war, Armenian society placed a great deal of trust in Minister of Defense reporting, which usually claimed that the Armenian and Nagorno-Karabakh troops were resisting, retaining control of many territories, preparing counter-offensives, and conducting tactical retreats. A term Hovhannisyan once used to explain the loss of some territories in the southern part of the region. After the ceasefire announcement on November 10, 2020, when Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan announced that he signed a ceasefire to stop the war, with Armenia agreeing to withdraw forces from Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan gaining control of significant territory, among other conditions, a fuller picture of the war emerged. The public began to suspect that the state information system had misled them. The situation became especially dire as officials began updating casualty stories, which rose much higher than expected. Amid this fallout, Hovhannisyan, the public face of the state's information system, became a target of distrust and accusations that he was spreading false information. Thank you. And I will be happy to answer a question after Hanna will finish with his presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope everybody's doing great over there. I think it's like 4 o'clock. How much time do we have? I really don't want to eat into any questions.
15 minutes, and then afterwards, I think we'll have enough time, and we'll go through some questions together.
All right, lovely. Thank you so much. So this is part of a wider project between Florentina, Lilia, and myself. Florentina did the theoretical part, Lilia did the empirical part, and I'm doing the analysis, sort of combining both sections. And it was a real honor to work with these two individuals, and it's a pleasure to be here. I remember I did my dissertation was on Armenia's foreign policy of complementarity, and it's an honor to continue my study. So I want to open up with a quote, the quote by Giyas Ibrahim, a Azeri citizen and signatory to a letter calling for peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And he said, they say truth is a first casualty in war, and that has certainly happened here. It sort of seems like one of those often repeated phrases, cliche, but I think it really works in this particular situation. There was a man called Stuart Kaufman, and he wrote a book on nationalism, and he said that nationalist conflicts are often driven by manipulative leaders. So leaders that want to distract from the domestic situation, they push people's aggression toward an external enemy. We saw that in World War I, and I think that also continues to be a trend here. So to continue on this issue of controlling the narrative. So the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is not simply a conflict over territory. It is an information war. It is a war fought over a political narrative that reinforces national identities, creating angels of the self. We are the good guys, and demons on the other end of the spectrum, the enemy, right? So controlling the narrative is a central part of this conflict and any conflict, especially when it comes to legitimizing aggression and violence in the eyes of the population and the other countries in the international system. So even today, we're seeing that this is continuing. Russia right now is seeking to paint Ukraine as a Nazi state. And since Nazism is linked to the forces of evil, destroying Nazism is an acceptable thing to do. It's something that should be done because you're destroying evil, right? What could be better than that, destroying evil? But the narrative and these ideas, they don't necessarily have to be true. They can be lies or myths. I think that's what Florentina brought out perfectly in her paper. And I'd like to call upon an old anarchical syndicalist by the name of George Sorel, and he understands the power of myths. So Sorel says a myth cannot be refuted, since it is at the bottom, it is identical with the conviction of a group, being the expression of these convictions in a language of movement. So in this particular case, we're seeing myths construct a national narrative that serves as a backbone for these imagined communities. And so myths legitimize the group. This helps consolidate and promote the national embodiment, and any action can be justified if done in the name of securing a national identity or national security. Now, war is a terrible thing, but war is a way that states pursue power. It's a political motivation. There is a desire to dominate others in this contemporary world order. So the way that the world is set up, it naturally pushes states to conflict. So Armenia and Azerbaijan has been called a frozen conflict, but this conflict is indeed a misnomer because there's been border clashes, right? And the essential part of my paper and our paper is that the narrative is more important than the territorial conflict, because the territorial conflict is pushed by the narrative. And so the narrative helps people to understand the identities, and then the identities help us understand the war. And so that's what this presentation, our work, is all about. So what's the essential part about identities and these imagined communities? It's all about what's called cognitive bias. And it's a very natural thing. We seek out the people that agree with us, right? Dopamine is a system that rewards you. And apparently, research has showed that the delusions are created by cognitive bias, generated by national identities or agreed upon ideas. And so these delusions will enhance someone's opinion. Not really, they don't really care about the facts. Like, facts are trivial. What matters the most is the dopamine. It's this collective identity. And so when you look at one great example I found was this Ghost of Kiev myth. Initially, when we started hearing these stories about the Ghost of Kiev, this fighter jet that was taking down Russian planes one after the other, I said to myself, well, that doesn't sound right. How can this plane from the 1980s shoot down Russia's advanced planes? Doesn't make any sense. Eventually came out that it was false. But as one Twitter user said, true or not, this Ghost of Kiev myth is exactly the kind of inspiring story the resistance needs right now. So we have inspiring stories, we have myths, and we have action that promotes action. So Ukraine may end up being totally destroyed, but that's okay because we're preserving this national myth. Doesn't make any sense. So we're destroying something to save it. Doesn't make any sense, right? There has to be other opportunities lost, right? And we have this delusion. And I think that what Lilia was speaking about, this we are going to win hashtag, I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce it, provides an excellent case study of highlighting the power of disinformation, cognitive bias, dopamine, the eventual despair that follows surrender, right? The sense of betrayal felt by the citizens of Armenia stemming from Pashinyan's surrender, especially in light of Hovhannisyan's positive daily updates. So it hurts the national identity. It creates a delusion that eventually creates despair and mental disorders, right? So it's the aspect of mental disorders that I am very interested in. So distinguishing between facts and lies, this helps us understand the difference between the myth, the national identity, and what's going on the ground. And Lilia provided several reasons related to her argument on hybrid war, hybrid war to divide and weaken Armenia, to create a pretext for war, to annex territory, to ensure a peace treaty with Armenia on Azerbaijan's own terms, and to ensure access to European markets on its own terms. So the information campaign has one crucial aim. The Azeri information campaign has one major aim, and that is to legitimize any violation of Armenian sovereignty or the status quo by controlling the war's narrative, right? So the narrative is leading the conflict. It's not the other way around. The narrative is leading the conflict. This is very clear to me. And so the first thing we have to understand about the Azeri narrative is to divide and weaken Armenia to ensure a peace treaty on its own terms. So in war, it's essential to reduce the enemy's will to fight. If the enemy does not have the will to fight, the enemy will surrender, right? You don't have the motivation. If there's no motivation, you can't get the acts of sacrifice, if you want to call it, that war needs. So when you look at the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive was designed to increase Vietnamese casualties in order to make the United States look really bad. So, and that would discourage the United States from continuing the war, because the American media will expose the horrors of the conflict and then reduce the will of Americans to support the war or to continue the war. Similarly, in Armenia, videos of these beheadings, these terrible beheadings that were eventually sent to the families of the soldiers, mortify, and it diminishes the citizens' will to continue fighting. So it's going to divide the society. There are going to be those people that are against the war because of these horrific acts, and those people who want to continue the war to get revenge or what have you. And so this divides the country in half. So propaganda that aims to show the futility of conflict may further convince people to end the conflict. And the hope is that Armenia would suddenly give in to the pressure and surrender to accept our Azeri demands as part of a new truce deal. So the tactic is very, very close to terrorism, as the aim is to terrorize non-combatants into surrender. So that's it seems to be that would be the political goal of Azerbaijan. The next point is to create a pretext for war, to annex a territory, and also, this is key, ensuring access to European markets on its own terms. So back in the 19th century, you have Otto von Bismarck, and he was a very brilliant statesman for the time, and he created the pretext for war to unite the German-speaking peoples of the German Confederation. And he did this by making France the aggressor, by a brilliant tactic of manipulating the Kaiser at the time, Kaiser Wilhelm I's telegram. So in a very similar way, we see the creation of the pretext for war necessary to achieve the goal of regaining Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, and any other Armenian territory necessary for Azeri national pride, power, and long-term security and prosperity in a zero-sum way. So it was Azerbaijan that started the conflict on September the 27th, 2020, with its missile and air attacks. But the Azeri perspective is that they were liberating the lands from occupation by launching a counterattack. So you can make a narrative out of that, right? And that's what they did. And the thing with that is that Armenia's occupation has been the status quo for the past 28 years. So in order to retake the entire Nagorno-Karabakh region for Azerbaijan, the only way to secure or achieve that goal was through war. There was no other alternative for Azerbaijan. Of course, many Armenians are right now against the current peace agreement, and they're refusing to accept the outcome of this conflict. So going forward here, we have to note that any violation of sovereignty, of any state's sovereignty, is going to upset or create a backlash for you. We're seeing that with Russia and with Ukraine. Russia is, as we know, attacking Ukraine, and all of the world, well, most of the world, Europe and the United States are punishing Russia for this. Of course, China and India and Iran are taking advantage of Russia's alienation in the international system, and that could be very dangerous. However, in this particular case, any annexation or any war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, you would expect, right, would elicit a harsh Western response, right? You can't do that. You can't violate the sovereignty of Armenia and so on and so forth. However, this just didn't happen. It didn't materialize, this Western objection. So any violation of the status quo you would expect to cause a great outrage in the international community, specifically between the United States and Russia. The European Union. Again, Azerbaijan sort of played a very good hand in the sense of they have a really good strategy internationally. So they're closely linked to Europe and the European Union. They're very closely linked to the United States and Israel, for that matter. And so the relationship between Armenia and the West is not as tight as Azerbaijan and the West. And because of this, no one really objected or no one really punished Azerbaijan for the war. Armenia is in a very tough position. It's landlocked. There's no real resources except for the human resources, very intelligent, people, very hardworking people. But, they don't have the sort of caviar diplomacy that Azerbaijan has. And because of that, it's left in a very difficult position. They don't have that relationship. So taken together, it is clear that the war of narratives, the soft power of Azerbaijan, kind of trumped Armenia's position in the international community. And it's because of this, they've had a very, very difficult time. And I think that has led, and especially Russia, you think being part of the security community, that Russia would step in or assist, at least diplomatically, putting an end to the conflict. However, Russia knows that Armenia is dependent on it for security. So whatever happens, Armenia is going to have to accept it. Whereas Azerbaijan, they're more like they want to placate and balance against Western influence in Azerbaijan. So that goes back into a lot of international relations. And not to plug my own book, but my first book, Weak States in International Relations Theory, that explains this benefit or strength of weak states. My apologies for that. Anyway, taken together, just to wrap up, I want to wrap up now. We see that it's clear that the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan is not simply a war for territory, it's a war for narratives. It's a war for who's right and who's wrong. It's a war about who has the better sway. Interests matter still, right? Interests matter in the sense of if no one cares about you, no one's going to step in for you, right? And I think that's the problem. The war has been particularly brutal with human rights violations. And I mean, that still did not help the Armenian cause, right? And I think Amnesty International is calling for independent reviews on both sides to ensure that the perpetrators of the war would be brought to justice, which is a good thing. We should have NGOs participating and be creating transparency for this conflict. But lacking the will to fight and really increases your chances for surrender. And I think that information war helps bring that together. So in short, the human rights violation, the sense of betrayal felt by the Armenian population leads me to believe that the conflict is certainly not over. And rather than looking at territorial conflicts, we should look at the national conflicts as they remain, the identities, this adverse relationship between the two sides, because it certainly won't be over there will be further conflicts in the future. Armenia might try to regain lost lands. Azerbaijan might seek to connect itself to Nakhchivan. Certainly, the demonization of both sides will continue, as the identities of Armenia and Azerbaijan will have a dichotomous relationship. So to be Armenian is to hate Azerbaijan, and to be Azeri is to hate Armenia. And each side will continue to have their own national narrative driven by falsehoods tied to the national myth. And so the war will lead to further demonization and a canonization of the self versus the other. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. We're going to take a few questions now. We actually have a few questions, so we're going to take some time for that. One of the questions is, how do you respond when one of the well-known and so-called respected media outlets willingly participates on promoting propaganda? Carlotta Gall from the New York Times repeatedly spreads disinformation about Armenia and promotes Azerbaijan as the victim of Armenian aggression. How does one respond to that? And this is open for all panelists.
This is a what outlet?
I'm sorry?
Where's the outlet?
New York Times.
Most major media, like, go ahead. Oh, I was just I'm sure we have a slightly, okay. No, I was going to say that most major newspapers have a type of ombudsman, and that might be one place to go to file a complaint about it and to ask for a correction of the record. So that would be one way to go. Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
You cannot be because, as we mentioned in our presentation, there are so many scholars employed by the Azerbaijani government, right? So I think that the best tactic is just, to engage as many Armenian scholars living in the West as possible in order to actually push forward our own narrative, in order to push forward the truth. And this is what we are doing. For instance, just a quick example, at our university, I founded the Caucasus Security Studies Initiative, which we are conducting webinars where Hanna and Florentina, they are a part of this initiative. We are publishing policy analysis. So this is one, of the way to confronting this type of behavior is just have more scholars, telling the truth. I'm not saying it's really difficult to be pro-Azerbaijani, pro-Armenian in the West because you need to have the balance of objective position. But in the meantime, the truth has to be told.
I would like to say something because that was my question. Can you guys hear me? So, Carlotta Gall is a longtime New York Times reporter based in Ankara. She has and did during the war and even before the war and after the war, essentially has provided the Turkish and Azeri narrative on just about everything related to Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. The New York Times ombudsmen and editors have been bombarded with requests from the Armenian community to correct the record, and they've been ignored. So this is a different type of a challenge. When you have a so-called respected outlet like New York Times, a willing participant in spreading propaganda and disinformation, and a recalcitrant editorial board and ombudsman, with all due respect, getting Armenian scholars to respond is not going to be enough. What can be done to take down the New York Times for being complicit in spreading this disinformation with a reporter who has gone native?
Yeah. So first of all, I encountered this even with reporters who I interviewed for reporting from the danger zone, who were extraordinary reporters in some areas and completely wrong in this area. And one was Roy Gutman, completely doesn't get what happened historically. This is a huge challenge, but one of the things that might be possible is there are really great Armenian journalists now at the Washington Post, at Politico, at other places, the LA Times. Let them report on the New York Times, shoddy reporting as well. Get them to, it's a hard thing to do, but it's quite possible that other outlets can help out the bad outlet.
In this
It's a
case,
really
maybe
tough
some
thing.
legal actions, because, maybe some legal actions. What, I couldn't hear what she reported, but if you are saying that she is a well-known journalist and reporting for the New York Times, maybe some legal actions can be taken.
I don't think legal action can work because of the First Amendment. That's not possible. No, I think it has to be embarrassing them. If they're not going to take it up themselves with the ombudsman's office, then I think it has to be getting really good journalists who do understand the situation to report on it, whether they're Armenian or not. I mean, I always take note of when there's a great journalist who is at another outlet. There's one at the New Yorker, Khachadurian, that might let the New Yorker after them. That's quite a great investigative outlet. I saw another good Armenian journalist at the LA Times. She's under a huge amount of pressure right now because she busted the sheriff's department for some human rights violations. But she's really standing up to it. So there are great journalists that are willing to do this sort of a thing. And I think it's important to get them on the case.
So there's also Brenda Schaefer, and I forget which outlet wrote about her and her ties to Azeri oil, and it didn't do anything, and she continued to publish. So right now it seems kind of hopeless. Are there any other avenues or things that we can do to combat this? Because they have a huge reach, and like you stated, they control the narrative.
Wow. Well, this is going to take some thinking for sure. I would be I'd like a list of these journalists to give it some thought. I really would. And I'd like to do some work on it. Like I said, there's also, there have been outlets who have Armenian journalists and wouldn't let them cover the Armenian issues, which is, even the LA Times at a certain point, they had Robin Apkarian, Mike left, Greg Krikorian left, but they wouldn't even let the Armenians cover Armenian issues, saying they were biased, which is ridiculous, because that's like saying Jewish people can't cover Jewish issues or Black people can't cover Black issues. So there is a certain, kind of bias around the Armenian issue that needs to be addressed. But yeah, give me a list. Let me give it some thought. Yeah, there should be some actions on this, and it might require some real brainstorming on it, because, as these wonderful scholars have also noted, Armenians have not done a very good job of sort of the public diplomacy end of things. But we're a small community, and it's really hard to counter massive amounts of disinformation. We're just overpowered in so many ways. But, where I live now in New Zealand, I watch New Zealand, and the public diplomacy from that country is remarkable for a country of 5 million people. Everywhere I go, people are like, "Oh my God, Jacinda Ardern, she's such a hero." I'm like, you have no idea the neglect in the country. She's good in some ways, but it's like the public diplomacy magnifies New Zealand by this enormous amount. And I think there's some lessons to be learned about that, about how to frame Armenia, Armenians, and the Armenian issues. And that's something we all need to be thinking about.
So one of our next questions is, are there legal paths to redress propaganda and misinformation in a conflict context?
It's much more difficult because of free speech laws, but I know that the United States is the strictest with that, but there may be other places where it's, where, hate speech is not legal.
Can I say something? Even with all due regards, Maria, you are saying free speech, but I gave the example of Cardi B and Elton John, who posted pro-Armenian narrative during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh war. But because of the public outrage of the Azerbaijani users, they had to take it down. So my main point is that Armenian is just being very passive. In Armenia, outside of Armenia, in Europe, in the United States, because Azerbaijani are everywhere. They even have posters on the Greek buses saying that Artsakh with Karabakh. Hanna was telling me in North Carolina, in Florida, we have these big, boards with Artsakh, Karabakh is Azerbaijan. I never seen saying Karabakh is Armenia anywhere. So I do agree with you that public diplomacy is actually, losing from the Armenian side, but I just believe that Armenian scholars or journalists or just, regular political analysts, they are not as active as Azerbaijanis. And as Hanna mentioned, cover diplomacy, it all boils down to money, of course, that the Azerbaijani government is willing to spend, right, on this propaganda.
And if I may, it's not all hopeless. I mean, there's a lot of things that Armenia is doing right. I mean, I don't know if anyone knows of the band, probably one of the greatest metal bands out there, System of a Down. They're constantly talking about the Armenian issue. And in 2020, in response to the war, they came out with a statement. And, that really kind of brought the issue to light. However, it's important to note that Azerbaijan also came out with their own metal song, some sort of cringy video of the Azeri military forces. It's kind of like glorifying the violence there, whereas System of a Down was speaking more about, stopping the conflict. So it's definitely an information war in the sense that there's tit for tat. So there always has to be a response. Armenia has to work hard, and Armenians need to work hard to counter the narrative. I mean, that's the basic point. I think that more visibility maybe, and I think conferences like this is an important thing. I think System of a Down's work is very important. So just continuing that ongoing, there's no rest in this situation, just continuing the effort to highlight the issues that Armenia is going through, I think is essential, especially because you need to counterbalance Azerbaijan. It's like you have to balance it. Like you can't do caviar diplomacy. You can't afford it, right? You don't have oil. So what do? You have to use your talents, So that's what as a fresh-faced person to this issue, I think that's one of the primary drivers that Armenia needs to push further, especially when it comes to popular culture.
I agree with Hanna. I would like just to give a very quick example. Recently, we had a webinar on the Russian and Ukrainian war. I was one of the participants. And because I mentioned about Nagorno-Karabakh during my presentation, which was literally 2 minutes, I had 10 Azerbaijani students at my university. I didn't know how we have so many Azerbaijani students bombarding me with questions about genocide committed by Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I didn't see one single Armenian student. And I know that we do have Armenian students at FIU and, at other universities, even to asking one single question. So this is just an example. As Hanna mentioned, nationalism in Azerbaijan is real. We are losing not only in information warfare, but also in, creating patriots, not nationalists, right? But patriots who love their countries.
Can I just add something that has nothing to do with that specific thing, but that is one of the points that the wonderful scholars here brought up was that one of the goals is to divide Armenians and to divide Armenia. And I've been thinking about all the fighting that is going on among our people and how successful that Azerbaijan has been in dividing us. And that might be something for us to talk about as well.
I think we have time for one more question. So I'll turn.
I think to understand why Armenians cannot resist the Azerbaijani Information Board, let me bring this example. I was in a media conference in Georgia, and the government official accepted that. They have given 700 apartments since 2011 to 700 journalists for free. But they keep the ownership certificates in their hands. So when the journalist misacts, they can take back the apartment. This is a fact. Even I'm now watching the BBC was writing about this. So Aliyev was preparing his nation to the war, including the media, including the democracy. So we are in Armenia kind of victims of our democracy. We keep changing our government, and they do not change their government. We cannot bribe our journalists. We cannot give apartments for free to our journalists. It never happened in Armenia. So, but in Azerbaijan, again, like 700 journalists is like 60%. But in Armenia, even now, 60% of media is in the hand of opposition, something that cannot happen in Azerbaijan. So is this a dilemma? Is this a dilemma? Is this one of the reasons why they are unified? Because I saw this expression in one of the slides. Fake news are often created by state. Come on, it's not often. It's really mitigating. It's all created by state. Because again, well, 80%. We're reading that every day here. I mean, there is no independent media there. But again, in Armenia, 60% of media is in the hand of opposition. That's why they have some success there. So is this a dilemma that that country bribes and accepting that yes, 700 apartments to 700 journalists? Of course, they're not going to write anything against the government. And we not do that here because it's not our message to the world.
You know, I'm just thinking about some of the public diplomacy campaigns that other countries have done. And I'm just what came to my mind was Switzerland, because, you know, they were financing Nazis and people knew that during the Second World War. And they wanted to switch gears and promote a different image. And so what they did is they started promoting their direct democracy so that people just associated Switzerland and direct democracy, and it made people forget about the Nazi stuff. And so if you think about like what you just said about Armenia and democracy, I mean, that is something that can be promoted. It's a way of, you know, framing the good. Frames are all about what is said and what is not said in part, right? And so what is it good about Armenia and Armenian culture and society and governance and all of that, and culture and history and heritage? There's so much in the story to tell beyond what does get out. And so I think a coherent frame around those really positive things is important, but we have to also buy into it.
You know, we do that, promoting.
Yeah.
But the Western democracy always puts parity. The only place we do not have parity, we have in a better position is in the European Court of Human Rights. We brought many cases now. They're in a good position. But in all other platforms, diplomatic, political, monitoring, human rights, everywhere they say a little bit to you, a little bit to you. So it's like parity. It's a geopolitical agenda of today's world to put a parity between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much for a great panel. But we have reached the end. We did go over just a little bit, but that's okay. We had we had a lot more questions that unfortunately we couldn't get to. Thank you again. Thank you to the three who are remote. We did have issues in the beginning, but we came through and we got it done.